So sometimes I get scared, and sometimes I get sad, and sometimes I get mad. Sometimes I just like struggle, and maybe I don't even know exactly why. And sometimes I worry that I'm not good enough. Sometimes I think I should know more or be better at things or have more compassion or be more patient or look different or act different. Any number of shoulds in my brain. The truth is that sometimes I'm not very nice to myself inside my own head. Does anyone else have that? Okay, like, no, not me. Okay. So when I am feeling this way, there are some things that I do. I have some like tricks and techniques won over the course of 40 plus years that I use to try and be kinder to myself. Sometimes I breathe like we do when we do our bull ringing, right? I just stop and I'm like, and I breathe in and out. And sometimes on the breath in, and this is something I teach my children too, on the breath in, I tell myself I am loved, and on the breath out, I tell myself things are gonna be all right. Sometimes I eat a snack because it turns out all I really am is just hungry. And sometimes I take a nap because sometimes I'm just tired. But sometimes I have to do a little bit more to intentionally take control of the way that I'm talking to myself inside of myself. So there are phrases that I'll repeat to myself, things as simple as like, I'm okay, like to soothe that fight or flight response, that lizard brain. Sometimes I'll say things like, I can make good choices. I can make good choices. Sometimes I'll tell myself I'm enough. I suspect that some of you have phrases like this that you will tell yourself in your hard moments. There's one other thing that I do sometimes, and that is sometimes I sing to myself, which feels a little silly to say out loud, but it's true. And sometimes I do it inside my own head, and sometimes I do it softly out loud. And often what I sing are things that I have learned as a Unitarian Universalist. So I will sing hymns to myself. And we're gonna sing a couple of the ones that I sing to myself. We're gonna sing them today as a group. So you get a little window into my world. Because they are hymns that are basically self-talk, honestly. And I wanted to be sure that we did one of them while the kids were still upstairs with us before they go downstairs. This one that we're about to do all together is one that I sang to my older children when they were babies, and I sing it now to the baby, who is still a baby. It's a reminder that each of us is precious, each of us is loved, each of us is just by our very being important and special and full of possibility. It's a reminder that we are, each of us in our own way, beautiful. And now I know many of you know this one, and perhaps you sing it to yourself as a mantra too. So I'm gonna ask you to remain seated and sing it with me now. You can sing it and think about yourself, if that feels like too much in this moment. You can sing it to someone near you. You can sing it out to the world at large. We're gonna do it a bunch of times. I'm not sure how many. We're gonna see how the mood strikes us, okay? But we're gonna sing it together, and children, you don't have to go anywhere quite yet. I want you to be here with us for the duration of this song, okay? All right. Anyone ever tell you you were anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you you were less than whole? How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul. Don't let anyone ever tell you that you are anything less than beautiful or less than whole. Your loving is a miracle, and to be in community with you is a precious thing. Children, at this point, I will ask you to gather with your teachers. You're going to continue to talk about the ways that we talk to each other and to ourselves, and tools and tips and tricks. So you can report back to us later. Give us all some new learning. Dawn, are you going to take them down? Okay. You're going to gather with Dawn. Dawn's going to bring you downstairs. I promise Dawn is very kind. Come on. I do. Oh, I do. Okay, please do. They will demonstrate. Okay, we'll see y'all later. All right, I think she's got them all. Thank you, Dawn. Our first reading this morning is a poem titled Self-Talk by Rosemary Watola Traumer. Because I know in my body the power of spaciousness, I command my heart, stay open. Stay open, I growl, as it clenches and hardens and granites and steels. But my terrified heart keeps clenching anyway, tighter and smaller and stuck. I said, stay open, my voice a demand, as if with intensity I could force a release. And the heart curls in, intent on survival, like a pill bug, like an armadillo, like a heart that has learned before it is not safe to love. And it hurts to be small. And it takes so much energy to clench that finally it's exhaustion that helps me to hear the softer voice beneath the command. The quiet voice that arrives like the slightest of waves, the voice that arrives like low morning sun. And the voice enters the clench of me like gentle rain meeting dry earth. And it says, of course you're afraid. For now, it's enough to remember the possibility of opening. Some days, it is enough to remember the possibility of opening. Sunday mornings that we spend together like this help us to practice many things. We practice our breathing, we practice listening, we practice mantras, whether we call them that or not. We practice compassion, and we practice keeping our hearts open to one another and to the world. We take time often in our services to share our joys and sorrows, and that is what we're doing. We're practicing open hearts, insisting that even when it's hard, our sharing together and our witnessing of one another matters. It is part of our human condition to suffer. We have literal physical nerve endings that experience pain. We have a form of consciousness that means we know we will die. We know what loss is because we know what death is and because we know what love is. And all of this means that at least part of life is suffering, unavoidably, for those with typically developed empathy and feelings. To be human is to experience pain and loss and regret and fear and grief and anger. To live is to at least occasionally experience the parts of life that we would classify as suffering. Religions across the globe have recognized this and have taught various lessons because of it. Some teach that life is suffering because of our own attitude toward life. others that life is suffering because God is testing us, still others that life is suffering in order that we learn something. And cultures have their own responses to suffering as well. I have shared with you that I come from a family with religious diversity. It is also a family with some cultural diversity. In some parts of my family, life is suffering, but it is a joy, nay, a duty to complain about it. In other parts of my family, there is no suffering. No one is suffering. Spoiler, there definitely is, but we're squashing it all down. We're stuffing it down until it pops out sideways. In still other parts of my family, the suffering happens loud and big and in your face, whether you want to hear about it or not. Each of us, whether by culture or religion, was taught how to suffer, right? That's how I want to say it. How to behave in our suffering and how to think about our suffering. And each of us was taught implicitly or explicitly what suffering means. We were taught a way to respond to the natural pain and suffering that comes with being human. So I'm going to ask you to take a moment to reflect on the lessons you learned when you were little, young, about suffering. Now, only do this reflecting if it feels safe and comfortable. Okay, please do not. If it does not feel good to you, you can opt out and you can just sit quietly. It's okay. And I'm definitely not asking you to remember and relive the suffering itself. We're staying a step back, okay? We're staying back at that place of how were you taught to react to it? What was the lesson you learned about reacting? And as you are willing, it's one of those mornings, I'm actually going to ask you to turn to someone near you. And again, you can always opt out. And as you feel comfortable, just briefly share. Were you taught to push it down, shout it out, pretend everything was fine? Did the response you were taught depend on the type of suffering? Like were physical and emotional suffering treated differently, right? So you'll take a moment to share, again, as you feel safe and comfortable doing so. Friends on Zoom, as you feel comfortable, you can write into the chat and have a little conversation all together there. And I'll ring the bull when I want you to stop chatting and come back again, okay? Okay. Go. Nobody wants to do it. What were you taught? I have to say, so I both love and don't love when we do the sharing because I hate making you stop talking. Like like seriously, I watch you and I'm like, wait, but they're so engaged. I want them to keep going. So here's the first thing I want to say really clearly, and I hope that that was an interesting exercise to sort of hear what someone else's lessons carried forward were. The first thing I want to say really clearly as we go on this sort of exploration of suffering is you do not have to continue to believe what you were taught as a child. If you have not already let it go, you are allowed to let it go, right? You do not have to continue to embody the behaviors around suffering that you were trained in when you were young. We are allowed to evolve and grow and change. In fact, the idea that we can, that we benefit from it, that we are called to change and growth is pretty core to Unitarian Universalism. Those childhood lessons, we can keep them, we can chuck them, we can keep part of them, we can decide what serves us and the life we want to lead now. So with that as a starting point and keeping in mind the values that we share of love and justice and equity and generosity and interdependence, I am going to spend my time this morning sharing with you a few things that I have come to believe about suffering. You can agree, you can disagree, definitely tell me about it later. I want to know. The first thing that I want to say is that I absolutely believe that suffering is not inherently redemptive. So said another way, suffering is not the path to salvation, redemption, and goodness. Said yet another way, it isn't by definition virtuous to suffer, okay? So for centuries, the thing that always comes to my mind, part of my family is Catholic, is that for centuries, Catholic women were taught to stay, told to stay, made to stay with abusive husbands because their virtue was found in their loyalty and their forbearance in this time of trial. For most of my life, the term martyr was used in my circles as a positive thing, someone who so believed in something they would die for it, and that they should be praised for that sacrifice. We continue this message about suffering being valuable when we suggest that people shouldn't protest or engage in violence potentially when they're being persecuted or harmed, but instead just sort of suffer quietly and virtuously. We have continued to valorize in many ways suffering in silence. It's like a phrase, right? To suffer in silence. Now, to be clear, in each of the cases just mentioned, the suffering are made to suffer because a judgment is being made about the value of their life and survival and whether it matters in relationship to other things, right? So a wife's safety and survival was seen as, and still sometimes is seen as, less important than appearances or her husband's reputation. A martyr was worth more dead than alive because with death they can become a rallying cry for others. Where prejudice and oppression operate systemically, a persecuted person's fight for freedom must be done in ways that preserve the comfort and safety of the oppressor, or the protest is judged as divisive or unjust. My tolerance, or lack of tolerance, for others being made to suffer is grounded fundamentally in my belief that we are not awaiting redemption or salvation in some next life, but that right here and now we belong to one another, depend on one another, and have the obligation to make life better for one another, not encourage one another to suffer. This is like the first thing. So if you've been needing to hear it, I will tell you that I truly believe that God, the world, life, the universe, your family, your community does not need you to suffer in order to value you or see you or know you. Your suffering is not required for you to count, for your life to matter. Life doesn't have to be hard all the time in order to be important. Right? And you don't have to prove anything to me or anyone else using how much you've been through or how much you are suffering. Another thing I have come to believe is that while suffering is not inherently redemptive, and while I truly, to the core of my being, hate the phrase, every cloud has a silver lining, it is possible to learn something or discover something or remember something because of the suffering we endure. I'm not going to say that it happens every time or that it has to happen every time or should, that dreaded word should, happen every time. But sometimes it does. Sometimes pain is just painful. Sometimes there is no lesson except that life is sometimes painful. But there are times that I believe that if we approach our experience of pain and suffering with curiosity, with a certain kind of openness, we may discover new ways of understanding ourselves, new ways that we want to be in the world. In part, this is exactly because we do change over time. Our response to physical pain changes over the course of a lifetime. So too does our response to emotional pain. I meant what I said earlier. My capacity to deal with hard things changes based on how much sleep I've gotten and if I've eaten well in a given day. It has also shifted over the course of my life because the resilience I have learned has made things feel different. When one of my children was younger, they went through a period of asking what it would feel like when someone they loved died, because they never experienced it, and it was this looming thing. And it was such a crisis for them as a child. And the question was always the same. What will I do? How will I feel when you die, when grandma and grandpa die? And I remember that fear, actually. I didn't until they asked me, and then I remembered what it felt like back then. Before you had experienced that kind of loss, the fear of what it might be like. And, you know, everything willing, halfway through my life, the fear is different because I've been through more and I understand different things now than I did as a child. Suffering can, at times, be our teacher. Help us grow, help us change for the better, prepare us for the future. A third thing that I believe to be true, we cannot control a lot of the suffering that life puts in our path. We can only control how we respond to it. This one is especially hard for me. Especially hard for me. The desire for control and the illusion that I have it or I could have it in the future is something I learned very young, and it is deeply ingrained and very hard for me to let go. So I will say that the past almost 5 weeks in this cast have been a reminder, like a very present reminder. I do not have any control over whether or not these weeks of immobilization have worked. Or I'll be in the 50% that needs to have surgery when it comes off because of a tiny fracture in a tiny bone. I have no control. It is humbling in its way. And so I do what I can and I control what I can, which is I wear it like I'm supposed to. I let myself be worried and sad when that's what I'm feeling. I breathe through the pain that still comes, and then I live my life. Because if I spent every moment fretting, I would get nothing done. There is a lot we do not control in our world right now, a lot we never have, and it is causing many of us to suffer emotionally and materially. We can't control international politics, who is fighting who is terrorizing who. We cannot control the actions of our political leaders quite as one-to-one as we might like to control them. And when the state of the world and the actions of our government fill us with fear or anger, it can be tempting to shut down, shut it out, pretend it isn't happening, or it can feel so dispiriting as to be immobilizing. But when faced with things that we can't control, we control what we can. Our own response to the world's suffering and our own suffering. We can work to keep our hearts open to the pain of others so that we do not become immune to the world's needs. We can shout from the rooftops our absolute belief that it is immoral to deprive another human of their basic human rights. We can make calls and protest and stick to our values, and we can also be gentle with ourselves when we do need to hide for a little bit. Because that's another thing we can do. We can control not shaming ourselves or others as we learn best how to navigate pain and suffering. You're allowed to find it hard, to want to hide, to indeed hide sometimes. It's okay, as long as we reopen. A fourth thing, I have never stopped believing a lesson that I learned in part through religious community and in part through treasured friendships. Our suffering is made easier by participating in communities of care and by cultivating relationships of honesty and authenticity. I have said so many times that humans are not built to be alone, even for those of us wired to want and need a lot of times solo. Companionship and support and care still matter. For a lot of my own life, I stuffed my own stuff down and focused on others. Any good therapist will tell you that that conditioning contributes to my being a minister today, right? This is not a terrible thing. It is possible to bring forward useful skills even as we let go of the less useful self-visions, right? I can take the skills I learned and let go of the idea that I have to do it all the time. It took decades for me to learn how to ask for help, functional or emotional help, and even now I will occasionally shame spiral and get really mad at myself if I need something. because childhood teachings live really deep inside us. But what a truth it is that humans do in fact need one another. We need help from one another in different ways across a lifetime, to be sure, but we always need one another. In large part, we need one another to mitigate the suffering and pain of being human. Because while the opposite of pain might be pleasure and the opposite of suffering might be experiencing joy, I want to say this morning that the antidotes to pain and suffering are the love shared between us and the hope that we can inspire in one another. Jackie. So there is one last belief I want to share with you alongside, I'm going to do that thing where I recap everything real quick for you. So alongside the belief, my beliefs, that suffering is not inherently redemptive, that sometimes, but not always, it can help us learn important things, that we can control our reactions, and maybe not much else, and that connection and community help us to navigate the hardest parts of our lives. The last thing I want to say is that I believe that even as we acknowledge that life involves pain and suffering, even as we suffer, we can still experience joy. We can live with hope. We can seek change. Not only can we are called to create joy, called to cultivate hope and make changes that increase the hope and joy that everyone can feel and access. The truth is that humans are wildly resilient. Stories throughout history and around the globe at this very moment teach us that truth. Humans can withstand so much more than we think we can and still survive and know love and laughter and happiness. Joy and woe are woven fine is that William Blake quote. We share our joys alongside our sorrows on Sunday morning. We do not separate them for this very reason. We know that over the course of a lifetime, we will feel joy and pain in so many different ways, and still we're called to say yes. Yes to life, yes to the hard work of community and change, yes to love, yes to this moment, yes to each other, yes to ourselves. So let us honor our suffering, embrace the wholeness of our experiences, and let us say yes to rejoicing anyway.